Okay. We're going to start from scratch as far as your DesignBais, how to get started with DesignBais. The first thing that we normally start with is having a look at the individual files within your application. My application has a file called DB Client, and I'll just move the telnet window in, and you can see that this is a typical PIC application, MultiValue application, and with a number of dictionaries and a number of records. Now, the very first thing that I need to do is describe that file to DesignBais, make that file available to DesignBais. So I'll just move that out of the way, going to File Properties, and enter the file DB Client. In this case, I've already filled in some details previously. I give the file a description, and down here I've got, typically this section up here, the file type, number of records, and the average record size is used if you are going to use DesignBais to create a file. So if you've got a brand new file and you want DesignBais to create it, then you can key in that it's a data file, number of records, say you've got 20,000 in there, the average record size is 1024, create the file. In this instance I'm not doing that, so I've already got the file created and I'm just telling DesignBais that they can use that file. The equates from file, in this case I've put a program file named dblib. With DesignBais, once you've defined your dictionaries to DesignBais, you can then create your program equates. When you select the Create Program Equates button in the field properties, it will write them out to the file that's specified here, which is in this instance dblib. If you want your dictionaries to have a prefix when those equates are written out, then you can specify that here too. And we've done that because lots of multi-value systems have dictionaries with ID and desk in them, or key and desk, and this gives you the ability to put prefixes in front of those when you're building your program equates. Do I want to enable auditing? There is the simple audit, which is this first one, and that'll effectively write to a file called DBA audit, and it'll just have the previous version of the record and who made the last change. It doesn't highlight the actual changes. It just stores a copy of the previous record. There is the extended audit, which will keep every copy of a record that gets written as a result of a DesignBais screen. With the extended audit, when I'm displaying the audit results, I can put a search process against that particular audit file, and in this case I'm saying run the standard client search function against that particular audit file. So I'll just open up another session and just quickly show you that. So if I go into the audit display, select the client file, records to display, I can click on this records to display, and that shows me the client search function as nominated back in this files property here. Are we to include the account in the audit file? If you've got a situation where you've got multiple accounts that are updating a single file, you want to include the actual account in the audit so you can see which account. It might be the same user that's updating the record, but it might be in multiple accounts. Then you would include the account name in the audit. And as a standard, DesignBais uses a pipe character as a key separator for the audit file, but if your keys include a pipe character, then you might want to change that to something else, say a tilde or an underscore or something like that. Drop-down selection statements I will cover a little bit later on in this session. There is also do you want to include this file in Express Reporting? And Express Reporting is an ad hoc reporting tool that is shipped with DesignBais. So this part of the screen describes to the DesignBais engine how this file is to be used within that Express Reporting, and I will show that very briefly at the end of this presentation. So effectively we're happy with the fairly basic definition of the file. I've got a file name and a description, some extra information if I want to build the equates and what sort of auditing structure I want to add to that particular file. I submit that, so that file can now be used by DesignBais. So the first thing to do is now that I've got that file defined, I'll select that file, is to load the dictionaries. So what that'll do is that will load the dictionaries that DesignBais can use from the file and make them available to DesignBais. So what it's saying here is that I've loaded the dictionaries. I must now retrieve and submit a single field from this file. So I'm just going to list all of the field properties. Field properties is what we call a dictionary. So if I come down here, you can see that I've got, say, client name. I'm just going to bring one of those back and submit it. When I do that, that will re-index, that will produce an index of that file, of the dictionaries of that file, that just make it a little bit faster in the Forms Designer and make those dictionaries available. We didn't want a situation where the load dictionaries performed that process, just in case you were doing this in a live system and you wanted to load additional dictionaries, and we didn't necessarily want that to be re-indexed. If I want to create the program equate at this point, I can say generate the program equate as well, and I'll just show you what that looks like. DesignBais has an editor, which is a browser-based editor, screen editor I should say. So if I have a look at dblib e.db client, which is that equate that should have just been built from me pressing the generate equate button, you'll see that that's generated the program equate with all of the various fields, and there's down the bottom there's all the work fields as well. And I'll explain the difference between record fields and work fields in the field properties, which is where we are right now. So I'll just bring one of those records back up again. I'll list the field properties, bring up the client name. You can see that that's the base dictionary name. That's the field. That's the name that the dictionary will be created as. So I could have a situation where I have a dictionary that's called, the field is called DBC client name, the dictionary is called client name, and the equate name is called dbc.clientName. So I've got the ability to have different structures as far as the field name, the dictionary name, and the equate name. And again, that's just so when we create equates, we don't fall over duplicates if the file is using ID and desk and names like that. The screen label field is the field. It's the description that will be used if I add this field to a form. The report heading is the description that will be used if I add this field to a report. Multi-value heading if I add the field to a multi-value field, and the express heading is if I'm using this field in an express report, then I might give it a different name as well. The reason for that is you might have a situation where you have multiple fields in a particular record that have a name that is either the same or very similar, and it's a little bit hard for an end user to discern the difference as far as what that particular field is doing as far as the name of it's concerned. If that field is used in an ad hoc reporting system, this gives you the ability to provide a little bit more definition as to what that field actually does. The client name is in attribute 1 of my client record. It's not multi-valued. If it was multi-valued, that would be ticked. It's not sub-valued. Now, sub-valued, DesignBais will maintain sub-values, but only as far as text entry is concerned. It won't allow a direct reference, or it won't support a direct reference to a sub-value as far as the screen is concerned, because the screen itself doesn't really have that third dimension to be able to support that. And I will show you an example of how the field sub-value is used in a design-based screen. Is this field a work variable? Now what a work variable is essentially, that means that when it is added to a form, it will use a variable called dbWork. And that dbWork variable will not get written to a record by default. If this is not checked and I add this field to a file, to a form, and I've performed a read and I'm going to write this particular client record after the form is written, after the user hits the submit button, then by default this client name will be updated into attribute 1 of the record variable. What type of field is it? It's an alphanumeric date and time. What is the field length? Now the field length is really only as a guide. It basically describes to DesignBais how big to make the field in the first place. It is not a number of characters limit. There is the ability, once the field is added to a form, to limit the number of characters that are entered on a form, but that is not done here. The group name. If I've got a multi-value field, and I do have a number of them here, DBC contact notes, you can see that that's got a group name of contact. What that means is that that this is part of an association group or an associated group, and the contact notes, whenever a field is added to the form, or a multi-value field is added to the form that has contact notes in it, and the lines are inserted or deleted to that multi-value, any other field that has the group name of contact that is not on the form is also maintained. So it also has its rows inserted and deleted. The input conversion is effectively upper and lowercase. There's not a lot of input conversion that you do in a browser type environment, because we've already explained that the field would be a date or a time. It's alpha, it's numeric. Is there an output conversion? If I want this field to be converted differently on a report and to a screen, I can add a specific output conversion to that. Is there a select conversion that I want to apply to this? So if we go back to contact name, DBC client name, you'll see that that has an MCU conversion on the selection. So the record itself, when it is written out, doesn't necessarily need to apply any case conversion, but when the selection applies, it will convert the name to uppercase. So that way you will always get a hit if there's a mixed case against a description. Select group extract or correlatives. That's if you want to do a translate, a group extract or something like that as part of this particular dictionary for the purpose of selections. What type of justification would this have? If it's a numeric field, it will automatically have a right justification, but I can specify a specific justification for that field if I want to, on a vertical and a horizontal plane. Is there a standard, now in version 6, there's this new feature, is there a standard input conversion and output conversion subroutine to be used? And effectively what that means is that the browser by default, the dates are 12/1/day/month/year, or if it's US it's M/day/year. But you might have a situation where your users for years have been using applications where they just put in 0302, and that means the 3rd of February in the current year. If you have those sorts of constructs, then you can just basically set your field type to alpha or date or numeric, depending on what sort of construct you want, and then add an input conversion subroutine or an output conversion subroutine, which effectively means that instead of DesignBais looking after the formatting of these specific date and time type conversions, or it could be any sort of number conversions, this means that you can take over those and have a multi-value program looking after that. Is there a lookup file that is always used with this particular dictionary? So let's say, for instance, I was adding country, DBC country, to a form. DBC country, I know has a file that has a list of countries called DB country. So I could add their DB country to the lookup file. So every single time I add the country field to a form throughout the product, DesignBais will automatically add the drop-down list and the file list for country to that dictionary. So I'll just save that entry with the country, and I'll just stop here as far. Actually, I won't. I'll just go one more field, which is the this help text window here. If I want to add standard help text to support the entry of this country field, then I can add that here, and that will show up in F1 help when during the running of the screen. I'll leave the rest of these other properties for the moment, and I will come back to some of those shortly. So the next thing to do, we've defined all of our fields, we've defined the files, we've defined the fields, is then go into the Forms Designer to actually start developing a form. So the Forms Designer presents me with a few questions to start with as to the type of form that I'm going to create. So the first thing is the file name, and I'm going to create the file, the Forms Designer, against the client file, which is the file that I've just created and loaded the dictionaries for. The reason we ask for file name, we could just have, we could have just created a situation where you just enter a form name, but if you've got, like a lot of our clients do, thousands of forms or hundreds of forms, then it's much easier to have them categorized by file. So the form name, in this case, I'm just going to call it W35 for webinar demonstration. Give it a form width and depth. I tend to work 1000 by 700 as a standard. That depends on the types of media that you're delivering to. If you're writing an application that is specific for an iPhone, or a web app that's specific for an iPhone, then you would use a smaller footprint form. But typically, because we're developing for the web and people are going to be using applications with Chrome and Safari and their large screens, and even an iPad, really 1000 by 700 is probably a reasonable size. The style group that I want to use, so I'm going to select DBI Web 61 here, and this style is the same style group that was used to create this application. That means that I don't have to make the choice as to what every field will look like, what every input field, every label will look like. By assigning a style group to the form, I'm setting up a number of choices that have already been made as far as look and feel. The advantage of that is that I can have a number of programmers working on a project. They use the standard styles associated with the style group. Then my application maintains a common look and feel. There are a few buttons, a few different selections here that we will revisit in this session and in the more advanced sessions as we go through. So I just select the designer at this point because I've answered enough questions to get me into the designer. So now I'm in the designer. You can see I'm presented with effectively a blank canvas that is divided into 10 pixel grids. And there are some slightly darker grid lines here which give you your 50 pixel and 100 pixel marks, so it's a little bit easier to work out the widths of fields and so on. And then I'm given a number of menu options at the top, which are the actual functions associated with the Forms Designer. We'll start with the add field. Now the add field, because I've selected the client file as the file that the form is based on, it's given me selected me the client file to start with and given me the list of dictionaries associated with the client file. And I can select, say, client code, which is the key to the file. And this is an input field including the text, and add that to my form. So I'll just put that about there. That's the first field that I've added to the form, and it's the key to my client record. So what I want to do now is I want to define the read. So what I've done is I've selected the properties associated with that particular field. Now there's two ways to do that. The first way is just as I did then, and select the properties by clicking the properties menu option, or when I click on that particular field, I just click on it with the control button pressed, and that will take me directly into the properties field, properties form. Now, DesignBais reads are one area where people do get a little confused, so I will spend a little bit of time on that now. The client code is the key, and I can see that that's there as attribute 0, so that is the key to this particular record. So I want to read now, when the end user keys in something into this client code field, I want to read the client file and put the record that was read somewhere. So this is going to be the first read that is on my form. So I'm going to call that read group 1. And this is the first key part on the form, or read step in the form. So the client code is the first key element to the file, to the DB client file. So I'll make that read step 1. If I had a multi-part key where I had company, branch, warehouse, and product code, I've got a 4-part key, I would have read steps 1 through 4 for this read group 1. But in this case I've got a single part key, so I just specified read group 1, read step 1. I want to read it into DB record. So essentially if you made this into a pick statement, it would say read DB record, which is the variable, from the DB client file, so I'll select that now, using DBC client code as the key. Now what type of read do I want to do? In this case I want to do a lock, because I want to have some sort of protection on that record if I update it and somebody else has made a change to that record in the meantime. And that's an optimistic lock. What that does is that will check to see whether the record has changed when I write the record. The alternative, if I want to have exclusivity on that record and I don't want anybody else, I don't want the chance that somebody else will update it while I'm looking at it, then I can select that as an exclusive lock. Typically though, web apps tend to use optimistic locking, and so they select this lock option. But that's entirely up to you. So that's all I need to do to specify the read, and I'll submit that. Now, if I go back to the add field mechanism, now I can add all of the other fields to the client code, from the client file to this form. I do have another mechanism to add fields to the form, which is the fast option. That doesn't give me a list of dictionary names. This just gives me a blank field. And in that, because I know that I have a name field, I can type in name and that'll give me the respond with the dictionaries that have name in it. So that's the one I want. Now if I do a control click there, that will leave the list up there if I wanted to pick more of those and add that dictionary to the multi-add list. And the multi-add list, I can add as many dictionaries as I like to this, and then when I press add, it will add all of them to the form. So I've got my name, I'll go to the street address now, I'll select that one, add that to the form, add that to the multi-list. I've got a suburb associated with that, add that to the list, probably a state, add that to the list, a postcode, add that to the list. So you can see that this is adding those dictionaries to this multi-add list. Country, add that to the list. So that's pretty much all I need to start with. So I'll just add all of those to the form, and there they are, they're on the form. You see that the country because I made country by default to have a lookup file, it's given me the basis of a drop-down list at this point. So if I turn test mode on now, key in a client code, you can see that that's refreshed the record associated with that client code 13. It's aligned the drop-down list with the country that belongs to that particular client. It's done the MultiValue street address in this case. And I haven't written any code as yet. We will do some coding to show you how this screen can interact with a program very shortly. So the next thing to do is I've got some MultiValue fields, as we saw earlier, which were contact related. So I'll go back into FAST, and this time I'll select contact. That's the DBC contact, that's the contact name. But this time I'm going to select MultiValue Input as opposed to an input field including the text. And MultiValue Input provides a grid style of MultiValue Input. So if I put that field there, you'll see it's the start of a grid. It's got, even though it's only one field wide so far, I'm going to associate this with the other fields in the MultiValue grid. So if I go back to FAST now, that was contact, and I know the contact's got a phone number, so I'll select the contact phone number as a MultiValue Input, add that to the form. And if I click in a cell within 15 pixels to the adjacent to the end of the last one, the DesignBais Forms Designer will associate those two fields. So I can continue on and select phone, email, contact email, add that to the form. And I'll go into multi-values, and you see that in the multi-values option I have a group called contact 1. So this is using the contact grouping that I demonstrated earlier in the field properties, and this is the first instance of that on the form. I'll make this, currently it's 50 pixels deep, so it's 5 of these grid elements deep. So it's not quite deep enough for the multi-value grid that I'm after, so I'll make it 100 pixels deep. I have the ability to allow or disallow the add button and the insert button, so that's this button and this one. And I have the ability to allow or disallow the delete button, which is the X button on this multi-value grid. And I can also have the ability to delete it with a dialog box, so that way if somebody hits the delete on a row, it can push DesignBais will prompt a dialog box that says, "Are you sure you want to delete row, whatever it is?" And when that user answers yes to that, then the delete occurs. Otherwise, if they answer no, the delete won't occur. So I'll just leave that as allowed. Now, with those buttons, the add, the insert, and the delete button, I can call a basic program, a multi-value pick program. Multi-value basic program, I'm sorry, that is used to add, that is used when the user hits the add button, when the user hits the insert button, or when the user hits the delete button. So that's useful if you want to check the validity of somebody clicking the delete button at a particular point in time. You want to make sure that that if it's a stock system, that they haven't already back-ordered stock, or they haven't already allocated stock in a different screen, and you want to put some warning or an error message at the point. There's also a post action. So once any one of those 3 events occur and finish, the record associated with that action has now changed. So we have the ability to call a post action, which will then present the new record to the program, so the program can then be used to do any recalcs of totals, total cost, total GST, VAT, or anything like that. So if I submit that now, you'll see that it's just very faint, but the multi-value grid line now runs down to this point. So we can have a look at that. So there's my multi-value grid, and we can insert rows, delete rows, add rows. The other thing too with this is that this allows an end user to continue to stay on the keyboard, so I can continue to type, and as I get to the end of the row and hit a tab, the new row opens up automatically for me, so it makes it much easier for an end user. One of the biggest issues you have with browser applications is that they don't tend to suit themselves to heads down data entry. With the DesignBais model, we've set this up so so that the user can very much support a heads down type data entry operation. Right, so the next thing that we want to do now is update this record. So I'll go back into the fast form, and you'll see down on the right hand side here I've assigned myself some preferences, and in that I have a button which is a submit button. And the reason I do this is because I've got some styling attributes associated with that button that I want to maintain, and I don't want to have to remember once I know them. So I'll just set this up as a preference. You can see over here that when I've clicked on that, this preference name has come up. So if I want to make changes to this to change its default descriptions or column spans or row spans, or the process after, or return fields, or anything like that, I can just come over here and add that to the preference, and that'll update the button that's there. So in this case, I want to put the submit button on the form, and I'll just add that to the list, the multi-add list, because I also have a clear button that I want to add to the form. I'll add that to the list, and I also have a delete button, and I'll add that to the list. When I add that to the form now, those three buttons are added to the form, and to move them I just click on the one I want to move and place it where I want it to be. So click on to grab it, and I click on to release it. And whilst that button is active, or control is active, it doesn't have to be the button, it can be any of the fields on the form, I can grab that and move it to wherever I want to until I then select something else. So I have three buttons on the form, a submit, a clear, and a delete button. What I need to do is now tell DesignBais what to do when those buttons are pressed. So we'll go into updating, and the update parameters knows about a variable called dbRecord. Now dbRecord was the record in the read section. When I read the client code, I said read the client file, place the results of that read into the variable dbRecord, and the key that is going to be used is the client code. So in this case, I'm saying update the contents of dbRecord back to the file that it was read from. And I want to do that, in this instance, I want to do a write and release when the user hits the submit button. And in this instance over here, I'm saying null the record after the write. It's not much point doing a submit and then leaving the record still on the form, so I'll clear the form after that particular after that write takes place. And I can add now dbRecord. I want to delete that record whenever the user hits the delete button. This time, though, I want to have a confirm update. So that means that when I click on the delete button, I will get a prompt that shows up that says, are you sure you want to delete this? And if the user answers affirmatively, then the record will be deleted. And again, I want to clear the form once that occurs. I might have a situation though where I have a large data entry form. An insurance policy is a good example where the data entry may take 20 or 30 minutes. I might want to have a save button on that form just so I can save that record and go to lunch, and when I come back make sure that the record's still there. But when I do that, then I'd have, say, like a temporary save, a save button, or suspend or something like that button. But in that case, I wouldn't clear the form after the write. I would just write the form, put it in a temporary space, and then allow the user to continue on until they do the final form submit. Just depends on the application. I put a clear button on the form. So I can define here the clear form button. In this instance, is the clear button, b.clear. There's a clear from field. If I had a multi-part key, as I said earlier, with the company, the warehouse, company, branch, warehouse, and product, when the user hits the clear button, I may want to keep the company, the branch, and the warehouse, and only clear from the product code down. this gives me the ability to do that just as a default. So I can say clear from field, find the product code in there, and then DesignBais will find that field on the form and then clear the contents of the form from that point forward. So I'll submit that. So now I have a situation where I'll turn test mode on, key in a client code, make a change to that client, hit the submit button, call that client back up again, and you can see the change has been made. If I hit the delete button, are you sure you want to delete this record? I can answer yes to that, and that record will be deleted. I won't actually delete that one. I'll just say no to that. But if I had, that record would have been deleted. I'll just update that with a change. C00013, and hit the clear button, and that form's cleared. Now that's all well and good. It's a reasonable data entry form. It'd be nice now if it had a search process associated with it, so the end user could select the client code from a search list. If they could key in some sort of criteria to support the search. So we'll just have a quick look at the selection process. DB client, and I've already prepared one earlier, and it's called search 1. It has a symbol of construct as far as style group is concerned, so I say that the search form will have by default its standard styling. The advantage of that again is uniformity as far as the application is concerned. You might have a situation where you have various modules in your application. You might have an accounts payable and an accounts receivable and an order entry and a stock system. So you've got 4 modules in your system. You might have the style groups vary slightly for each one of those. So you might actually have an AP and an AR and a stock and an order entry style group that have slightly different color variants. So that way an end user, when they're in a particular module, knows just via the visual cues that they're in the stock system because the background color has a pale green or something, and when they go into the order entry, the background or the fonts and the fields have a blue in tone. So you can have that sort of setup if you like. So you specify the style group that you want to use for the search, and then effectively put in an access command or an English command, depending on what flavor of pick you use, to formulate a selection statement. So in this case, select DB client with DBC client name equal to left and a right wildcard, and a description to support that end user's entry. Now here I've got an entry point. Now this entry point here is numbered 1. That corresponds down here with the entry supplied number 1. So effectively what we're doing here in our input form is we're saying use the dictionary DB client, DBC client name as the input source for that. So any default routines that I've got for input conversions, validations, date and timestamps, or drop downs that are normally used on the field are inherited in the search form. And the reason they separate here and they don't use this one here is because this dictionary may actually be a translate. I might have select DB client with the company equal to 1, and company is a translated field based on some digit in the client code. But what I want to do is I'd want to use the dictionary from the company file that provided me the drop-down list of companies that the end user can select. So that's why we have an entry point and an entry supplied field, as opposed to just using the straight dictionary name as the input source. So if I move across to the right now, this is actually quite a wide form. This dictionary has an optional flag. So if I do not provide, if me as an end user do not provide a name that I want to search for, DesignBais will remove this with clause and what follows from the sentence. And that can become very useful when you have multiple parts of a sentence. So if I add to this a connective, which is an and with dbc.suburb equal to again, left and right wildcards if I just want to put in new for New York or something like that. Entry point 2, come down here, DB record, DB client, and there are searches associated with all of these. I'm just, because I know the dictionaries fairly well, I'm just typing them in. If I want to specify a particular width for a field, because the dictionary is if I could type, it would make my life easier. Suburb. If I want to have a specific width on my selection form, so my selection forms look nicer, so all of the fields have a common width, I can do that just by selecting a width associated with that, and that'll build the form with that common width. So my sentence now says select DB client with client name equal to whatever is entered and with the suburb equal to whatever was entered. Now if I make that optional as well, and I'll just get rid of that append and move that there, because this is going to be by the account manager as well. Because both of these are optional, if the user doesn't enter client name and enter suburb, the sentence will change to select DB client with suburb equal to, and it will get rid of the connective that's not used. I can make this mandatory though. I can say, well, the end user must provide a name or a suburb in this instance. You might have a situation where if they don't, you're selecting against a million record file. You don't want to return 5,000 pages or 500,000 pages of data. What you want to do is you want to make sure that the user gives you some sort of feedback before the selection is performed. So in that case, you would use mandatory. You also have the ability to accept a null entry. You might have a situation where you're checking to see whether certain values have or have not been entered, and null is actually valid then in the selection criteria. So I might have a situation where I'm looking for clients that don't have a client name, so I could say select client name with client name equal to null if null was entered. So I can also hide that from the end user. If my search form is being called from another form and the base form is providing the details for the selection, and I don't want the user necessarily to see what that selection, I can hide this line from the form. And typically then you wouldn't have data entry associated with that. You would just say equal to, you might have a category code, select DB client with category code equal to S. So in that instance, you could have that as being part of your selection criteria, but hide it from the end user so the end user doesn't see that. Or it could be a field that's provided from, a company field from a standard form. So I'll just leave. I'll put those both back as optional fields. And then right at the end, I just want to add some sort criteria to that. So the last line of the selection process, with last multi-value line, I'd put any append sentences if I wanted to do sort bys and things like that, or using dictionaries of another file. If you've got that type of structure, you can put that there too. And over here now, we've got the display fields. How is this going to look as far as the search results are concerned? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put this search on a form and then come back and explain that. So here I've got the client code, which is just a text label. It's not an active field at the moment, but what I want to do is put a button in its place. I'll put a hyperlink style button in its place. So I'm going to delete that field, go to fast again, grab my search button, and instead of the word search, I will use client code as the text. I'm going to call DB client search1, which is that search form that I've just constructed. And then I've got a return field. When the search button is pressed, I want to call the search form, but I want the DesignBais engine to know that I'm calling the search form because I want to fill this client code field automatically. So what I want to do is I want to tell it here to fill the client code. Even though this is the key, we could default that, but I might have a situation where I've got the country as a lookup. So here I could have a button for country. I might have account managers or associated clients that I'm going to call that I might have a debtor situation where I've got a client code and a debtor. where the client may actually have another debtor. So in that case, I'm going to call the same search, but instead of filling the client code field, I'd be filling the debtor field as the return. So I'll add that to my form. And you can see that's a hyperlink style button now with an underline underneath it. So if I go into test mode now and select the client code, here is my search form. I actually hadn't saved that one. That's actually got a select exec title on that one for some unknown reason. But anyway, this is showing me now the client name, the account manager number, the account manager's name, the phone number, the website, and so on, the email address, the town, city, the state, province, country, and so on. All of these fields are sortable. So I could sort by the phone number at that point. And so sort one way, click it again, and it'll sort the other way. That is just default behavior in the search. With search forms, a typical application form may have, say, 30 fields. They may have 2 or 3 search forms associated with that field, with that form. So what we've done is we've created the ability to simply create a search form, so you don't have to build those for your forms. For every form that you create, you just define the selection criteria, the fields that you want to display. So in this case, client name, account manager, and so on. If I come back to my search form, you can see client name, account manager, the account manager's description, it's not a great dictionary name, the phone, the website, the email, suburb, state, and so on. They're all the fields that I've added to be displayed as far as the search form is concerned. The after display event, if there is something that I want to do to auto-fill some of the fields that are on that search form, then the after display can do that. The process before selection, so the user, this particular search does a selection performed on load. So the moment I click on that and the form loads, the selection is processed. I can have a situation where the selection, sorry, I'll open that up again. I can have a situation where the selection waits for the end user to hit the search button. In other words, it's waiting for them to put some criteria in the fields, in these entry fields, before you run the search. So in that instance, the selection performed on load is switched off. Now, the before selection process is a basic program that you can call at that point to ensure the validity of the data that was entered. You might have a situation where you're building a search form to select transactions from a file, and the before process makes sure that the date from and the date to range are in the correct order. So you might write a program to do that. The after selection process is when the user's made a selection. What do you want to do with that then? You might have a situation where the user selecting a multi-part key, in the case of a stock file, where you have company, branch, warehouse, and product code, and that is the key that has been selected. So what you want to do in the after selection process is extract the 4 parts of that key and then present it to the 4 fields that are on the form. So you would do that in the after selection process. Page numbering is very useful, because as I display my search form like that, you can see down here this has got 14 pages of clients. So I can page through those particular clients 1 page at a time, or in this case 14 records at a time. If I don't have page numbering on, all of the clients that are returned plus all of their descriptions will get loaded to the browser to start with. Now, if I am returning 5,000 or 10,000 records, there will be a delay depending on what speed your connection is before it's presented to the end user. And if you're returning a search that returns 10,000 items, that's a bit of a waste of time anyway, because the end user is probably not going to make any sense of that, and they're going to want to refine that search. So typically we turn, if you're going to return more than say 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 records, turn page numbering on. because you give the user the ability then to say, oh, well, there's 14 pages of those. What I'm really looking for, now we're talking about the refined search option on searches, and this is another standard feature. I can say, well, what I was really looking for was something service center. So I can put service there and refine that. And this is a destructive refine. It will refine this particular list, refine those 14 pages that you can see back here to 1. Then I could say, well, I know it had something to do with video, so I type in VID there and then refine that again, and that's found video services. I could have put video services in 1, but I didn't know whether it was services video or video services, so this gives me the ability to constantly refine that. And when I select one of these searches, that then is returned back to the client code field because my button specified that search that was going to be run was linked to this particular field. Now, from a data entry point of view now, I have my search process. Oh, sorry, now that's the other thing. Auto selection of a single item is ticked. So because client name has already been provided, when I select client code here, the selection process said, oh, select the client with the client name equal to this interesting name video services, and then automatically return that. So if I clear this now, clear this form, and then go back to the search, now it's brought back all of the records. Now, but I've still had to hit this search button to do that. So if I'm building an application that is for a corporate grade user and not a public grade user, DesignBais allows you to create both applications that are targeted towards the public user if you're creating hotel booking systems, or you're booking flights, or you've got an online shop or something like that, or if you're building a corporate grade application because you want to process orders, you want to process payroll or something like that, or insurance, then the application, the style of the application is a little different, because you're giving end users that are going to be in the application all day, every day, specific features that wouldn't be necessarily available to the public user that only shows up on the website to book a flight or a hotel room occasionally. So if you're, in this case, I'm building a corporate grade form, so there's a few things that I typically do to make data entry a little bit easier. The first is, I'll just duck back out to the start form for this, is I'm going to say that whenever the user hits the enter key, I want the submit button to be pressed. So if the end user goes in, changes the name, and they just want to change the name and get out of there, they can change the name and hit enter, and the record will be updated. The second thing I can do is, as I'm on each field, DesignBais has a hotkey that allows me to invoke a search associated with that field. So in this field properties associated with the client code, if we come down to the bottom of this field, we've got a control plus enter button event. And in this instance, I'm going to say load the search. So as soon as the field, the client code field has focus, the end user can hit the control button plus the enter button together, and that will invoke the search. And the reason we don't use function keys is because the function keys are not uniform across various browsers, and in fact some browsers don't even really support function keys. So, but they all support the control enter function. So we've used that to be for the searches, because it's a fairly easy combination for an end user to get used to, and it's one that we know that will work all the time. Likewise, with my submit button, I'd like, when the user hits the submit button, for the focus to go back into the client code field. So when when the user hits the submit, I want the focus to go back up into this client code field so the user can then enter the next key without having to get the mouse and move the mouse to that field and click into that field. So that's and I'll do the same for the clear and the delete button as well. Look, return to field. Oh gosh, I didn't copy that dbc.client code. And also for the delete field. So now I have a situation where I've got some, because of this control enter button plus my focus fields, I have a situation where my end user experience is much more like it would be if they were using, say, a green screen application. So I turn test mode on, the cursor is automatically into the first field in the form. I can programmatically change that cursor. There is a DesignBais variable that will allow me to do that. If I hit Control and Enter at that point, up pops the search form. Now you can see that the cursor is sitting here in the select row. In my search, in my system parameters, I've specified that I want to have keyboard-driven searches. What that does is that puts a row number associated beside the various rows on the, well, in this case, the clients associated with each row. So I can put in a row number. So I could say row 6, enter, and that'll return that value. The other thing that it gives me the ability to do is page through things. So using just the page up and the page down keys, I can page through this search form until I find the one I'm looking for. That's the one I'm looking for, Apollo printers, and enter. So as an end user, I'm still on the keyboard, so I can tab through, get down to the contact field, and enter tab, key in some more details to do with the client. All the rows automatically open up. When I get to the end of this contact row, this first contact row, and I don't want to enter anymore, if I hit tab again, the field automatically progresses to the next field on the form. And in this case, that's the submit button. So I could hit enter at that particular point because the submit button had the focus, and that will update that record. So if we go back into here and I select, say, Newport Lighting, come down, and it's actually Newport Lightings for some unknown reason, change that to an S, hit enter, that record is updated. So as you can see, I've got in a browser application, there's Newport Lightings again, row 3. I've got an application that is very responsive on the browser. So, it's not browser pretty at the moment. I'd like, I can put some images on the form. I could put a little bit of grayscaling or color scaling on the form to make it a little bit more Web 2. I don't know whether you noticed, but the buttons that I've added automatically have flare for the mouse over events, just to make it look a little bit more like a browser application. I suppose the next thing to do is start looking quickly at the program interfaces associated with this. And the unfortunate side of this is what we've just created a client maintenance form, and it's very easy to create a client maintenance form in most things, but this is something that without the talking I could put together in about a minute, and I haven't written any code. It's fully functional, it's updatable, and it's also performs like a green screen application would. Okay, so now what I want to do is I just want to put some code on the form because I want to validate, say, the client name. I want to make sure that for some unknown reason our organization does not support anybody called Fred. So if the client name entered is Fred, then I want to put an error message up. And if there are any Freds in this presentation, then I apologize for this example. So this is the DesignBais editor. Again, I'll open up a program. This is my client program that I use for demonstration and training purposes. So now, on this client name field, I'm going to call in a process after db.i.dbClient, which is the name of this particular program. Now, naming conventions is entirely up to you. It can be Fred, George, Harry, db.i.db client. That's entirely up to your own standards. And the way that you interact with the provided variables that DesignBais provides your program is entirely up to you as well. The way I structure it as far as these types of presentations is I tend to have one program with everything in it. It makes it easier for me to explain what's going on. So the end user is going to enter something in the client name, and as that changes, so as the value in the client name is changed and the user tabs out of that field, I'm going to call this db.i.db client program to validate that data entry. Now that is called in browser speak, I suppose, or VB, ASP speak, a change event. And in this change event, I'm going to call this when the user tabs out of the field. But I also have the ability to call it any time the user leaves that field. So if they just click the mouse in there and click the mouse somewhere else, I can call that program. Or I can even key that on every keystroke. It's not quite every keystroke, because what DesignBais does is it delays the field for about 300 or 400 milliseconds. That gives the end user the ability to type something quickly, and when there is a pause in the data entry of either 300 to 400 milliseconds, it will then transmit the value entered. It just makes that process much more efficient to have that delay. So I'll just leave this as an on-change event. Hit submit. Going to the program. Now the on-change actually is a validation event. So you can see here I get a number of variables from DesignBais that tell me exactly what happened to this on that particular form. The first variable is screen root, and that is the screen that is that's the name of the form. So in this case, the name of the form is DB client W35. Now I also have a variable called process event, and the process event is the name that DesignBais provides, and it basically says what happened. And was it a button that was clicked? Was it an after display event? Was it a before screen or a get screen, or a before read or an after read? There are, as you can see, there are quite a number of different events that DesignBais will create for you. So then I also have this one, process event source. That describes the field or the button or the form name, or what actually the event occurred to, what item, what object, what form that did the event occur to. So in this case, the process event will be validation, screen root will be DB client W35, and the process event source will be DBC client name, because I've said when the client name changes, I want to call the program. So when we find the validate section of my program, so I'll just go down to the validation section of my program, and in this case you can see I've got plenty of examples from before, so I can say case DBC client name equals, I'll change that, case event source equals DBC client name. So in other words, was it the client name field here on this form that changed? Was it that field that changed? And if it was, then I want to check a variable called DB value. What was the value that was entered? So if DB value is equal to Fred, then IER.text equals no Freds allowed. It's all fairly basic at the moment. And return. So that's all I want to do is when somebody enters something in the client name, I want to put up an error message on the form and basically not allow them to continue. So if I turn test mode on now, key in a client code, key in Fred, you'll see that I get the dialog that comes up and says no Freds allowed, and more importantly, the value that was in the field before is now populated again. Typically, you want it to do that because you don't want the word Fred to stay there, because if the Fred stays there, then the user can just tab off that field. Or then you would have to have a loss of focus type event that then checks to see whether Fred is still in that field. But this sort of mechanism is what the majority of developers use nowadays. So it's a fairly commonly used approach. What I could also do at this point is I could say call dbi.g.glossary ir.text. So if I was designing my system to be used in an environment where it was going to be deployed, I should say, in a multilingual environment, so I've got Chinese users, I've got French users, English users, then what this glossary does is that, what this glossary routine does, and if I can find it again, here, it puts this message from IER.text into the glossary. So that way all of my program messages that I use throughout my application go into the glossary. So if I'm then converting my application to run in Chinese, all I need to do is go into the glossary. Sorry, no Freds allowed. Then in its Chinese equivalent, it's or French equivalent, Canadian, and based on the end user's glossary, it will present the user with in the language that you've used, and that can I associate this form with a menu. Every field description, in this case street address, state, province, zip, postcode, is automatically placed in a glossary. So if I wanted to convert my application to French, I go into the glossary and key in the equivalent an application, multilingual deployment. The other side of it too is that you might be deploying applications across multiple state boundaries where they have different names for the same thing. So you might have GST, you might have VAT. There's a number of one of your customers might call product item, and another customer calls product. So it doesn't necessarily have to be language. It can just be terms that are used in your application that specific customers or specific regions term differently. So you can use the glossary feature for that as well. So anyway, I have got a very, very simple interface there where I key in Fred in uppercase. I didn't OCOMV that or anything, to get that particular rule, business rule in our business where we don't allow Freds to occur. The other thing, I'm just going to wrap a case statement around that now. So just bear with me and I'll just make a case statement of this, bring in case DB value equals Fred, then set up that and make that that's not a begin, that's a begin, and an end case. Now the reason I want to do that is I just want to show you very quickly just a couple of other features that I can use here. So case DB value equals, I'll just make it SSS just for convenience, DB return to field equals dbc.pcode will do. Now why you would do that in a commercial grade application, I have no idea, but if I come here now and go SSS in uppercase, because that's all I've allowed, you can see now that the cursor's now moved down to that field. So I've got the ability to position cursors on the form wherever I want them to be by just using the DB return to field common variable. And all those common variables are mentioned in the manual, and we will go through the majority of those over the next, well, through the complete webinar series as we do the advanced programming techniques and advanced form designer. So if I say case DB value equals Google, for instance, I'll just see whether I've already got that code somewhere else in here. I'll just grab that. So in this instance, I'm just going to use a DesignBais variable called DB call URL. So you might have a situation where you've got Google Maps or something like that, and you want to show a Google Maps form for the address. I'm not going to do that in this particular instance, but so if I type in Google in this form now, in uppercase, I should do an uppercase check. You probably didn't notice that because I've got two screens, but it opened up a Google window at that point. So it's very easy to have interaction with other web applications, particularly Google, with Google Maps and things like that, because you can just specify in the URL that it's Google Maps and then add your street address, and then the Google map for that location will show up. So I'm doing this all within PIC code, and I'm just using various DesignBais common variables to control that structure. The other thing that I want to touch on very, very quickly is sections. I might have a situation, two other things actually, sections and inquiry mode. One of the other things that you typically do within a commercial grade application is you provide an inquiry version of a particular form. So in this instance, I want to have an inquiry version of my client maintenance form. So I'm going to have inquiry-only input fields defined. Typically, all input fields are disabled on an inquiry form, but I want the client code in this case to be enabled. There might be specific buttons that perform specific functions on your form that you don't want enabled in inquiry mode, so I could nominate those there. The submit and the delete button are automatically disabled because they appear in an updating section. There's also an images to disable. If there are any images on the form, I can select those as well. So basically, to turn this into an inquiry form, I just say, well, I want them to be able to enter in the client code, but I don't want them to be able to enter in anything else, so I submit that. So that's my inquiry form, and I'll show you how that's run very shortly. Now we talk about sections. I have client code and main. Client code and the client code search and the client code field, and every field that's on this form belongs to a section called main. And as I add the fields to the form, I have the ability to change that section name, and I can modify it later. So I'll go into field list. Here's a list of all the fields on the form, and you can see here that they all belong to the section main. So I want my search form, my search link, if you like, or my search button to be, actually I'll call that top, to belong to a section called top. And I also want my client code to belong to a section called top. My buttons, submit, clear, and delete, that are down here, I'll put those in a section called buttons. And I'll just make those other two buttons and submit that. So now I have three physical sections on my form. I have the top section, which is this, and I'll just insert a row here by selecting insert row at the top, and I just click where I want that row to be inserted just to separate those two fields. I can use delete row exactly the same way. I can insert columns. So if I say, well, don't want this hard up to the left edge like it is now, and say insert a column, select that, And then I just click where I want the column to be inserted, and that will move the fields across. Right, so sections. So I go into sections now, and you can see here that I've got my 3 sections defined: top, main, and buttons. Now top is enabled all the time, and that's its initial state. Main is enabled all the time, and buttons are enabled all the time. But I could have a situation where I say, well, button, the main section, this section in the middle, is collapsed. In other words, I don't want it to appear on the form, and I don't want it to occupy any space when it's not on the form, so I'll collapse that. And I'll collapse that until the end user enters something into the client code field. So the main section is collapsed until the client code is not equal to null. I just leave that blank in that case. Then I want that to be enabled. Buttons are disabled until the client code is entered. And then I want that enabled. Now I've also got a situation where with sections I can overlap multiple sections. So I could have fields on top of fields and say a tab view or something like that. So when the user clicks on the tab for contact, you want the contact details to show up. And what happens is you end up having fields on top of fields in the designer. This currently viewing sections gives me the ability to just see the particular section on the form and develop on that section of that form at that particular point in time. So currently viewing all sections. So if I submit that now, I have the 3 sections, turn test mode on. You can see the buttons is now up underneath the client code field, and those buttons are disabled. So I go into my search, select a particular button. This uncollapses then because there is a value in that field. And then when I hit clear or submit or delete, and this client code field no longer has a value, that part of the form is collapsed again. So it's very, very easy to create situations where you have sections that are enabled or disabled based on the values of other fields on the form. So let's have another look at that. If I have now, I'll add another field to my form called drop down, and I'll make that a radio button. Now you can see here that the radio button has apples, oranges, bananas, mangoes. I won't have that last one, and I'll just add that to the form and I'll put that up there. So you can see I've got my radio buttons with apples, oranges, bananas and mangoes. The field description is quite wide, so it's actually put those quite far apart. But what I can do is I can say column, delete column, and come here and just select that, and that will bring those fields closer together. So this field name is DBC dropdown, and you can see here DBC dropdown. Here are the various values that get added. So even though the end user sees the text apples, A is what goes back to the database. Oranges, O goes back to the database, and bananas, mangoes, and so on. I can have process after, so if I want to call a program at that particular point to see that apples is valid in that particular state or time of year or something like that, if I want to do some logic associated with that. So I can submit that now. And I could add another condition to this if I wanted to. I'll just get rid of that section control now and say main is not collapsed. I'll just leave it all enabled. And I'll create a section here against the postcode. I'll just call that P code as the section. Submit that. So now when I go into sections, I've got another section called postcode, and it's always enabled. But I might say, for another weird business rule like the Fred principle of earlier, I might say that postcode is enabled unless DBC dropdown is equal to M, because we don't want anybody in our system to be able to enter anything in postcode if the client has something to do with mangoes, for instance. So now if I enter mangoes, That field didn't disable for some unknown reason. Is that's actually probably not an M, is it? That is an M. Oh, then I've enabled it. I'm sorry. How about I try disable? So select mangoes, and that field disables. So it's very easy in this mechanism to have fields on a form that are hidden, disabled, collapsed, based on values of other fields on the form. Those other fields that these values are part of can actually be hidden, because I don't want my end users to know that. Actually, I'll just save that record just for the moment. Oh, test mode on. So I select mangoes. The zip and postcode is disabled. I hit submit. That's no longer mangoes. It is enabled, and I call that record back up, and that is now disabled. So I could have a situation where these fields here belong to a section called, say, hidden, because I don't want to know that we discriminate against mangoes in our application. So I can go into sections and say that the section hidden is hidden all the time. So turn submit on, and you can see that I didn't do it for the text, I only did it for the radio buttons themselves. You can see now that that's disabled even though that field does not appear on the form. Okay, so that's, we're getting close to 2 o'clock now. That is a very simple overview of how to get started with DesignBais, how to get your files defined, how to get your fields defined, and I'll just quickly show you one other thing, just very quickly, with the Express report, and we'll go through Express reporting in detail in a future webinar. But I loaded the client file, and now I have these fields associated with the client file that I'm able to report against. So just as an ad hoc report writer, now I can select the client code, the name of the client, the street address, the town, the zip code, and the country or whatever associated. There's the country there. Produce that report and select that. So just by loading the dictionary into DesignBais, and when I did that, when I created the file, I said yes, it's available to Express. You can then have this Express reporting system as a byproduct of defining your dictionaries correctly. I know that we covered a reasonable amount of ground in a short period of time. All these webinars are recorded, and we do have a DesignBais. We've just opened a DesignBais YouTube channel, and this will be placed on that YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Are there any questions for the next couple of minutes before we finish up? No? Well, that's great. Okay. I will close the webinar then.